Today, we're going to talk about shutter speed. Buffer. Hey everyone, it's Trent from the Visual Center, and today I want to talk to you about shutter speed, what it is, how it works, and how we can use it in our photography. If you have a manual camera, you can choose to use different exposure modes, and each exposure mode is going to allow you to pick different settings on your camera for each exposure. One of those settings is your shutter speed. Now be sure to watch my upcoming videos where I discuss and demonstrate different exposure modes. This is the cross-section of the inside of a DSLR camera. And this is the cross-section of the inside of a mirrorless camera. If you see here in the DSLR, there is a mirror that has to move out of the way every time you take a picture. In the mirrorless, there is no mirror, thus the name mirrorless. Behind this mirror, and just in front of your image sensor, you'll see both cameras have a shutter. This shutter opens and closes, allowing a specific amount of light into your camera and onto your image sensor. And just like aperture, shutter speed controls two things. First, the amount of light coming into your camera and hitting your image sensor, and second, the blurring or freezing of action within your composition. We'll talk more about blurring and freezing action in a second. When I was a kid, I can remember my parents taking me to a really old theater to see a movie. And I can remember two things about that theater. First, there was a person down in front playing the organ before the movie started. And second, the screen was covered by curtains before the movie started. They actually would open and the movie would start, and then at the end of the credits, the curtains would close back down. I can actually remember trying to stick around to see if those curtains would close after the end of the credits. The shutter in your camera is a lot like those theater curtains. It's going to open and close, allowing a specific amount of light into your camera and onto your sensor. Now, most shutters don't function like this. They don't open and close down the middle. Most of the modern day cameras are going to function with a shutter that travels vertically. It's going to open and then close and then reset. Open and then close. Let's actually take a look inside a DSLR and see how the shutter looks when it's functioning. This is the inside of one of my DSLR cameras. What you're looking at is the mirror inside the body of the camera. That mirror sits just in front of the shutter. Now when I fully depress the shutter release button, the mirror will move up out of place and the first curtain shutter will slide down to the bottom of the frame. The green surface you're seeing inside the camera is actually the image sensor. This is a 1 second exposure. This video is slowed down so it's going to be longer than 1 second. But once that exposure is over, that second shutter is going to slide down to cover the image sensor and meet the first curtain. And then the mirror will drop back down into place and the shutter will reset for the next exposure. This next exposure is going to be 1/4 of a second. So the mirror is going to pop up, the first curtain is going to move, and 1/4 of a second later, the second curtain is going to close and the mirror is going to pop back down. This third exposure is going to be 1/15 of a second. It's going to be much shorter, and so you'll see the image sensor for a much shorter period of time. This fourth exposure is going to be 1/60 of a second. You can barely see the image sensor. The next exposure will be 1/250 of a second, and you'll be able to hardly see any green at all. The last exposure will be 1/1000th of a second. Now you can hardly see the image sensor. Most cameras on the market today contain something called a focal plane shutter. The shutter sits right in front of the image sensor or where the focal plane is, thus it's called a focal plane shutter. Now be sure to watch my future videos where I talk about different types of shutters and why you choose one over the other. The duration of time that your shutter is open is called your shutter speed, and that duration of time is going to allow a specific amount of light into your camera and onto your image sensor. This scale represents a full scale of shutter speeds found in most modern day cameras. Now this end of the scale where you see those quotation marks at the end of the numbers, those represents full second shutter speeds. Now as I move down the scale, you can see fractional numbers. Those represent fractions of a second, half a second, 1/4 second, 1/8 of a second. Now if I continue to move down the scale, parts of the fractions have been removed just for ease of writing. So it's still 1/25 of a second, 1/250th of a second, 1/500th of a second, and so on. Oftentimes when a shutter speed contains 3 numerical values or more, the front half of the fraction is removed, but they're still fractional numbers. Now I'm going to erase the first few numbers and the last number. So we go from 1 second to 1/4000th of a second. This slightly condensed scale represents shutter speeds that most cameras manufactured in the last few decades are able to produce. This scale is important because it represents full stop increments. A full stop is either doubling or halving the amount of light. Now, if I move to faster shutter speeds and I move up that scale, each number I move up the scale, I'm cutting the light in half. If I move the other direction and I move down the scale, each number I move down the scale, I'm doubling the amount of light coming into my camera. Most cameras come from a manufacturer set up to move in half stop or third stop increments. Here is that full stop shutter speed scale. Now remember, depending on which way you move up or down the scale, you're going to cut the amount of light coming into your camera in half, or you're going to double the amount of light coming into your camera. Here's a condensed scale of half stop shutter speeds. And here's a scale of third stop shutter speeds. Most cameras are going to allow you to pick which scale you want to use for your shutter speeds. Within your menu, you should be able to find an option to change from third stops to half stops to full stops. Now, the reason why a lot of people work in half stop and third stops is just to help refine your exposure a little bit better for each image. Now, the important thing to remember is that if I'm using a fast shutter speed, this right-hand side of the scale, I'm actually letting less light into my camera. And if I go to the other end, this left-hand side, I'm actually allowing more light into my camera. And each number represents either a doubling or a halving amount of that light. So how does shutter speed control motion within a composition? If you use a fast shutter speed, you're going to freeze your object or your subject so it looks like it's not moving. If you use a slow shutter speed, you're going to allow your image sensor to record that object or that subject blurred across your composition. Here's a simple demonstration of what I mean. Alright, so I'm going to take a few pictures of me moving my hands within the frame. This first exposure is going to be a 2-second exposure. You can see because there's a number 2 with quotation marks after it at the bottom of the frame. Now see how you can barely see my hands. You can see that something's there, but it's almost blurred out completely. Now this next exposure is going to be half of a second. You see the number on the bottom left-hand side is changed to 1/2 a second. Again, you're going to see a little bit more density with my hands. And you can actually make out the shape of my right hand on the left-hand side of the frame. This exposure is going to be 1/30th of a second. You can see how the movement of my hands is getting shorter and shorter with each faster shutter speed. I'm actually going to move up 2 stops for this exposure and go to 1/125th of a second. Now you can see both my hands. They're a little bit blurred, but let's go a little bit faster and see if we can get them to freeze completely. Now we're at 1/1000th of a second. Now you can see that my hands are completely frozen. Let's take a look at the fastest shutter speed and the slowest shutter speed compared side by side. On the left-hand side, you see a 2-second exposure, and on the right-hand side, you see a 1/1000th of a second exposure. See the difference? There are 2 things that control the amount of blur within an image. First is the shutter speed your camera is set to, and second, the speed at which the object or the subject is moving. If I use a slow shutter speed, but I have a very, very slow object, it's still going to look like it's frozen. And the opposite is true. If I use a very, very fast shutter speed with a very fast moving object, it's going to look like it's standing still and frozen. Now, if I reverse one component of that situation, and I use a slower shutter speed with a faster object, I'm now going to get blur within my image. Now, here are some images by other photographers demonstrating creative uses of shutter speed. I really enjoy the fact that the photographers froze the action within these images. The only blur I noticed is within the boxer's hand. Now, the photographer could have used it just a little bit faster of a shutter speed and that hand would have been completely frozen. These are great images demonstrating a fast shutter speed. Now, in this set of images, I really enjoy the fact that the photographer used a slower set of shutter speeds. You can see how soft the water looks in the waterfall and the little bit of blur in the rower. Those lines on the road in the image of the city are actually cars moving through the frame. Those are headlights and taillights creating those streaks. Alright, now let's get outside and start shooting, and I can demonstrate some creative uses of shutter speed. So I've convinced Josh to join me on this part of the video.
How's it going?
We are going to use his Jeep to cross the little stream you might be able to hear in the background there. And we're going to create some splash with his wheels and try to freeze it and also try to blur it, all using shutter speed. I'm also going to teach you another technique called panning, where we're going to create his vehicle frozen and the water blurred and the background blurred a bit. Here I'm using 1/4000th of a second. On the right hand side you'll see Josh start to approach the water, and this is where I fire. This is the image, 1/4000th of a second. All the action in the frame should be frozen. This next image is going to be taken at 1/250th of a second. You should start to see a little bit of blur in the water. Let's move down to 1/60th of a second. Now it's easy to see the blur in both the water and the Jeep in this image. The last exposure, let's shoot at 1/15th of a second. Now you can see here's that image. 1/15th of a second is going to create a lot of blur. Let's compare the fastest shutter speed image to the slowest shutter speed image. So first, this is the fastest shutter speed image at 1/4000th of a second, and this is the slowest shutter speed at 1/15th of a second. Alright, so this is where I'm going to demonstrate the technique called panning. What I'm going to try to do is point my camera at the subject and move it as fast as the subject is crossing my frame. So there's my first image. What I'm trying to create is an image where the foreground and background are a tiny bit blurred, but the subject matter is frozen. Now I don't think that's working. I don't think there's enough blur in the foreground and background. So for this next exposure, I'm actually going to change my shutter speed to 1/15th of a second. I'm going to start to move my camera to match his speed. And there's the exposure. Now that's a little bit better. I like the blur in the foreground and the background better, but I think Josh and the Jeep are a little bit too blurry. So I'm going to try again at 1/15th of a second. Here I'm going to match the speed and take the frame. Now this one's even worse. I was moving a little bit too much. The Jeep and Josh are blurry. This next one, I'm going to go to 1/20th of a second, see if I can speed it up a tiny bit, still get the blur I like. This shutter speed is much better, but I didn't move the camera at the right speed. So I'm going to try one more time. You see here, I'm actually practicing my panning across the frame. I'm still at 1/20th of a second, and here you go. I think that's one of the best images so far. So you can see the foreground and background were captured with a little bit of motion blur, but Josh and the Jeep are sharp. This is called panning. It's a great technique when you have a moving subject. Hopefully now you have a better understanding of what shutter speed is and how you can use it to control motion in your images. If you have any questions regarding shutter speed or motion blur, be sure to put them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon for future video notifications, and I'll see you next time.
It's flying in the
Yeah, I
air.
know, man. This is ridiculous, huh?
There's flies everywhere.